You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford, Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Paul Vidich on the show with me today. He has an amazing new novel. It's called The Mercenary, and I'll tell you what, if you love spy novels, novels about spycraft and about the subversive nature of governments and the things that go on behind them, this is a must-have for your to-be-read pile. And I'll tell you what, I love the book so much. I'm super excited to talk about it today. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, Hank.
I'm excited to have you. Paul, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I grew up in a college town, Storrs, Connecticut. My parents were both professors. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, and we had a bookcase near the foyer. And I remember walking by the bookcase and looking at the books there and taking one out and thinking, I can write one of these, and I should try and write one of these at some point in my life. I put it back. I don't have a memory of what the book was, but my father was a professor, and he had written books, and there were books in the house everywhere. My mother was a very literate person. So I'm sure I channeled some of their interest in literature and channeled, the desire to write a book. But I had no idea what writing a book was. It was just an object, and I could have my name on it.
There's an interesting thing that happens with kids sometimes, Paul, that especially kids that are fascinated with books, is that there seems to be a moment when you realize that people make books, that they don't just, appear out of the ether, that there are people behind them, and they spend a lot of time writing them. And then, another company, edits and binds them, and then another company sells them, but they're ultimately produced by people. Having the background that you did with, being raised by two professors and your dad, a writer, was that ever, a realization that you came to, or did you just always understand the process behind a book?
Just before I answer that question, I should say I've never told this story to anyone because nobody has asked it, but but I have a very, very clear memory of it. To answer the question, I had no idea what the process of writing entailed. And certainly had no idea what it meant to hand a book over to an editor and a publisher and all the things that went into bringing that aesthetic object into the world. And even when I started writing as, after college, when I first moved to New York, I still had no real clue. And I think it's a bit of a mysterious process that you only begin to understand as you get close to it. The idea that you need an agent seemed sort of not particularly understandable. I could represent myself as well as anyone. But then it became clear that agents there are for a real purpose, which is that they know the people who might have interest in your novel. And rather than, a scattershot approach to sending something off to, many, many strangers, an agent has a good sense of who might be interested in the book that you've written. So I think the process of, I'm still having written 4 books, I'm still understanding the process and discovering some of the nuances of it.
Paul, you wrote a really interesting blog post about 4 or 5 years ago now, depending on what year we're in, because this has been a weird year we kind of lose track of time. But you wrote an interesting blog post several years ago called The Literary Spy Novel. And you talk about this event that happened in your family with your uncle, and how this sparked, through this obvious tragedy that happened in your family, this sparked a curiosity by you to look at the world a little differently. Could you talk about that a little bit, and what this did for your sense of curiosity and how you might tell stories now?
Yes, the incident that you're referring to is involved my mother's wife's husband, Frank Olson, cousin by marriage, uncle by marriage. He had worked surreptitiously for the CIA and died mysteriously in 1953 when he fell or jumped, depending on the version of the story you want to believe, from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel. That story, that incident, remained pretty unknown, except for the fact of his death for the family, until 1975, when the circumstances of his death emerged. But in the interim, as you know, being close to the family, I saw the difficulty that my aunt had, not knowing what he did, and Frank Olson not being able to talk to her about the work he did, and then later discovering that he also couldn't talk about his doubts about his work with his colleagues, because to do so would have been sort of to betray the trust of the job. And I saw him as a very lonely man, an insider wanting to get out, and ultimately he got out because he was murdered. And that character stuck with me. And as all writers do, you sort of, write a lot. And then at some point in your life, if you're lucky, you hit on a story and find a voice that allows you to tell a story that is authentic. And in my case, my uncle's story allowed me to enter this world of the spy novel from the point of view of a character who had moral qualms about the work and wanted to get out. So that aspect of the character became my way into the world of what I call the literary spy novel. But really, literary spy novel really simply identifies a novel that is character driven, where language is important, character is important, and plot is important. And the sorts of novels that I put into that category are the novels of Graham Greene, the novels of John le Carre, the novels of Somerset Maugham and Joe Cannon, who is a writer today. And all of them, plot's important, and there are thrilling elements to them, but they're not thrillers in the conventional sense. They're the plot comes out of the doubts and concerns and character of the protagonist, and that's what I've tried to do with my own novels. And I was fortunate to have this example of the Frank Olson case to help me find a voice that I could then use in the world, the imaginary world that I create in my novels.
We had Joseph Cannon on the show about a year ago, and I completely understand the distinction, the delineation that you draw between what you refer to as the literary spy novel, as opposed to maybe some of the novels that come out of the current trend of plot-driven thrillers. How do you draw that distinction, and what is it that that separates these two camps, if you will?
I think there are two things that separate them. The first is the care with language, the way in which the writer tries to be a stylist. And not all stories have to be good stories have to be what I'll say called well written. There are many books that have sold very well that were not particularly well written. But being well written, I think, is one of the criteria that separate genre fiction from literary fiction. The second distinction is the way in which a literary work tends to look inside the interiority of the central character or central characters, and you look at their fears, their suspicions, their concerns, their loves, their regrets, and those things then shape what I'll call a three-dimensional character. Out of that three-dimensional character emerges a plot or a storyline. And I think the greater the three-dimensionality of your characters, the more likely it's going to be considered literary. And this distinction has nothing to do with the sales of a book. You can have a wonderful literary book that doesn't sell particularly well, and you can have another book that's a thriller that sells extremely well. But what happens is that people read it and then they pass it along, and it doesn't really have enduring quality. Graham Greene's books, for example, or Le Carre's books, are written at a higher register of style, and those books by those authors have endured and will continue to be read for the beauty of the language and the sophistication of the characterization.
So your first book that you published came out in 2016, is that right? An Honorable Man?
Yes.
What was it that drove you to write this first novel? Had this desire to be a novelist been with you for a while? Was there an inciting incident, that dropped this story idea into your lap, as it were? What was it that took you from the life you were living to I'm going to write a novel now?
The answer to this is two parts. The first is I came to New York when I was a young man out of college and wanted to write novels, but I didn't have the confidence, and my wife became pregnant. So I then launched on a business career, which was very successful. I enjoyed it. But I sort of made a bargain with myself that when I was financially able to leave that job and write, I would. And that happened in my 50s, mid-50s, which was a little late for most writers. And then I began writing short stories, and I had published several and won an award. And I was happy with being a short story writer. I think the idea of writing a long novel or a novel of any length was daunting. But I got a letter from an agent who had read one of the award-winning short stories and said, "We love your writing, but we don't represent short story writers. Do you have a novel?" And I looked at my wife and I said, "Well, the only story I know that's worthy of the length of a novel is the story of this guy, Frank Olson, my uncle." I tried to write that, and I probably wrote 3 or 4 versions, and none of them were successful because it was a story I was too close to. And what I discovered is that in order to write well, you have to put some distance between yourself and the story, if it's a personal story in particular.
Right.
But I did find this character, the one I mentioned earlier, this person on the inside who wanted to get out, that loneliness of an individual with moral qualms doing work that he's uncomfortable with. So that character became the central character in An Honorable Man, George Mueller. And that then led me to write the book after that. And the third book I wrote, which came out last year, 2020, called The Coldest Warrior, I went back to that original story about my uncle and was able to fictionalize it because I was able to change enough things and put distance between the story and myself to be able to write something that was inspired by his death and his story, but wasn't his story.
Dream Author by Sophie Hannah is an immersive 14-month coaching program for writers at any and every level of experience, and also for those of you who want to write and are just waiting for the right encouragement and guidance to get you started. Your writing dreams should make you happy. For so many of us, our dreams are not a source of happiness. Instead, they cause us stress, guilt, frustration, and even shame. Here's the great news. All of these feelings are natural and all writers experience them. The problem, though, is that when your writing dreams bring you more anxiety than joy, it affects your resolve and your productivity, and you end up not taking the action you need to take in order to propel your dreams in the right direction so that they can stand a strong chance of coming true. That's why Sophie created the Dream Author Coaching Program to teach anyone who is passionate about writing how to change the way they build, think about, and pursue their writing dreams in order to become their own most powerful ally and advocate for the rest of their writing life. And more great news. Once you've learned that skill, it lasts forever. Visit dreamauthorcoaching.com to get started today. Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started.
I think a lot of new writers make that mistake of they write what they know, and a lot of times there's a story or a character or whatever that is kind of traveled with the writer for quite a while, and they've wrestled with questions and things like that. And a lot of times a first novel is the writer kind of working out some of those issues and some of the questions that they've had and different things like that. And I think you're absolutely right. That happens to a lot of people, that you write that first book and you're just too close to it. It's too much of you. It's too much of your ideas about things. And when a couple of rewrites or maybe even attempting a new topic, once you've kind of purged all of that stuff that you've been carrying on, can do the novel a lot of good.
Yeah. And there's another thing that's related to that. And it's a thing that characterized John le Carre's books. For now that he's passed away and people are evaluating his influence on the English literature of the last half of the 20th century, I think he's risen to the pantheon of great writers. But for a long time, he was dismissed as a genre writer. Somebody who was sort of in that little cul-de-sac called the spy novel.
Right.
And in fact, he is one of those writers, and I sort of think I'm in that category as well, who was able to take the constraints of genre and use them to free up an exploration of the human condition. And when you think about his books, what makes them so powerful, are obviously the language. He's a beautiful writer, characters, but he also does something that not many other writers in the last half of the 20th century did, which is he looked at the intersection between, let's call it, personal freedom and organizational constraints. He put his characters in a bureaucracy. In his case, it was the MI6, the spy bureaucracy in England. And it's that tension between the personal faith and the organizational constraints, the organizational loyalties that produced a lot of the tension and conflict in his books. And if you think about it, what's one of the conditions of the 20th century? We all, or most of us, have worked in big organizations, in bureaucracies, whether it's IBM or it's, the CIA or, some other organization. And it's a thing we all sort of deal with in our lives, the need to go to work. And then when you're at work, you have, in subtle ways, you're coerced into the group think that goes along with being in an organization. And that certainly is what happens in the CIA. And yet at the same time, you leave, you go home, and you are yourself. And sometimes that conflict, can create all sorts of tension. And certainly that conflict was very evident in Washington in the last number of years.
As a kid that grew up in the 70s and 80s, the Cold War, I got to witness kind of the height of the Cold War and then the fall of the Soviet Union, which, arguably may or may not have brought an end to the Cold War. But your books, An Honorable Man, The Good Assassin, The Coldest Warrior, and now The Mercenary, all occupy this space and time of the Cold War. Why is this such a fertile setting for a spy novel? And are there benefits to writing about this time period as opposed to a current spy novel that would be riddled with technology and the plot would be completely different if it was set now? What is it about this time period that fascinates you so, and what are some of the benefits of writing in this time period?
I think one of the benefits of looking over your shoulder a bit, whether it's 10 years or 20 or 30 years, is that some of the issues from that earlier period are clearer. They're sublimated. And it's sort of journalism which tries to be a report or a history in the moment is often wrong, and it also often misses the subtleties of what's going on because you don't have the distance to bring clarity. So that's one difference. The other is I also grew up as a child of the Cold War, and I remember the drop drills in school, climbing under your desk to protect yourself from the atom bomb, which all seems sort of insane. And I remember my mother not wanting us to drink milk in the early 60s because fallout from nuclear testing, had created radioactive iodine that fell into the grass that then the cows ate, and then it got into the milk. So there were all of these anxieties that were a part of my growing up. And so in some ways it's sort of natural for me to write novels about that time as a backdrop. But the other thing that to me is fascinating is that the men who went into certainly the early CIA in the 50s were young men who had gone to Ivy League schools, Princeton, Brown, Harvard, Yale, and idealistic young men who were caught up in the Great War against totalitarianism. America was a democracy. We cherish our freedoms. And the Soviet Union was this this dark enemy. And what happened as the Cold War advanced through the 60s and through the Vietnam War, a lot of these young men found that they were having to do things that were at the limit of legality. And the big conflict for many of them was that they had to do things that sort of went counter to their own upbringing, whether they be, Catholic or otherwise. And I think of a guy named William Colby, who had run the Phoenix program in Vietnam and then became the director of the CIA in the 1970s, a devout Catholic who ended up doing some very nasty things. And then, after he left the CIA, retired, his autobiography, you sort of read into it the regrets that he had for some of the things that he did. And to me, that those things sort of resonated, because we live in a world in which a lot of men in that type of a position have to make choices between your personal faith and the obligations of your job. And if you're working in the CIA and you're confronting a hostile world, sometimes you end up doing things that are, that you don't want to talk about. And some people in the CIA sort of glibly refer to themselves as legally sanctioned criminals, because they're not breaking the law. They're being told to do things. They're doing it, overseas, but it may be suborning friends, or it may be, extrajudicial assassinations, all of which is done to defend the things we believe in and cherish, democracy, freedoms. But at the same time, it can create a lot of, for some, not all, but for some, it can create a lot of doubt. And those are the people who I find interesting. In some ways, we're living in a different world now. There's still a lot of hostility in the world, but it's not as it was when we had the Soviet Union as our single largest enemy. Then we could measure annihilation, we could measure hope, we could measure border. But at the moment, the violence comes in the form of terrorism, and it's stateless. In some ways, that's more upsetting because you don't know how to defend against it. And so I think there's a little bit of what's going on now as people look at the Cold War, which is a little nostalgia for the Cold War. It was known. It was an easier world to know about, and you sort of took some comfort in the fact that in a world in which the two adversaries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, had mutually assured abilities to kill each other, that smart people, rational people on both sides would be careful not to pull the trigger or push the button.
Right. So your new book, The Mercenary, takes a look at this time from the other side of the coin, at least in the beginning. What was the motivation for this book? What was I'm really fascinated by where stories begin, and what was the first kernel of this story, and how did it birth?
I was fascinated by the 1980s Moscow. The Soviet Union was the twilight of its power, and that struck me as a good place to start a Cold War novel. It was at that moment when the country's illusion of dominance met the grim reality of a crumbling system. And typically what I do is I start with a place, a setting, and that setting sort of establishes the characters who are drawn to a place, and establishes the atmosphere and sort of the story's imaginary world. And so before I did anything, I said, let me see if I can set this in Moscow, because there's got to be interesting stories there, given the end of the Soviet Union, the corruption that was taking place. And yet it continued to be a significant threat to the United States. So when I began doing my research, I then came across autobiographies of high-ranking KGB officers who had successfully defected to the West. And there were 4 or 5 of these men, some executed for trying, others two were successfully exfiltrated. And that became sort of the premise for the novel I wanted to write, which was an effort to get somebody out of the Soviet Union who had secrets that would benefit the United States. And so that was the origin. I thought I'd done a novel in Cuba, 2 in the United States, and I thought Moscow would be a great location. And as with most stories, there's a reason you tell a particular type of story in a particular place. Spy novels tend to be set in Berlin or London, some in Washington, some in Vienna, but they're not typically set in Montevideo or in San Francisco, because there really aren't too many spies of interest in those locations. But Moscow and Berlin and London are hotbeds of activity. So it was natural to think about setting the book in Moscow.
What sort of research is available to you now to look at the way life was 30, 40 years ago, or technologies that were available then, or what how do you immerse yourself in a world that's so secretive, and so that you can tell it as realistically as you do?
Well, typically I research a book for about 6 months. And the best research for me tends to be biographies or autobiographies of people who lived at that time. In this case, I read the autobiographies of several KGB officers who defected. I also read autobiographies of American CIA officers who were the handlers of several KGB officers who were not exfiltrated and were executed. And I added to that by reading accounts of journalists who lived in Moscow at that time, and who, in one case, the journalist had been born in the United States, but his parents had been Russian. And when he went to Moscow, he researched, where his parents had come from, the village outside of Moscow, and gave a lot of color to Moscow at that point in time, which was the mid-1950s. So in some ways, it was just absorbing as much as I could about Moscow at that time. And once I had brought all of that stuff together into my own mind, I felt that I could begin outlining the book. And then when I began writing, a lot of the details that I'd picked up during my research, I was able to put into the book itself. And typically, with my characters, I will create pretty extensive dossiers on their lives before I begin writing. So I know them pretty completely. I know where they're born, what faith they practice, what scotch they drink, if they happen to drink scotch, the tics in their behavior, all this stuff that allowed me to represent them as sort of three-dimensional characters on the page.
And that sort of care that you give the characters beforehand really shines on the pages of this novel. And I guess that's what brings out the literary nature of this, is there's so much care that goes into the characters ahead of time.
Well, thank you. I do. The one thing I'd say about any artistic endeavor is that you need talent, but without hard work, your talent doesn't take you very far.
Right.
And I was in the music business for 20 years, and I always remember, impressed by Madonna, who I loved. In many ways, she wasn't a great singer, but she was a great dancer. And more than being a singer or dancer, she had a real commitment to work ethic. And I think when you look at all the people who have been successful as artists, musicians, or dancers, writers, those who are most successful are those who work really hard at it.
Right.
And the John Le Carres of the world. What's phenomenal to me is that here's a guy who died at the age of 89. He published his last book when he was 88, and over the course of his career, I think he wrote 27 books. The 8 of them were in the last 10 years or 12 years. And it's he committed himself to his craft, and he continued to practice it throughout his life.
Well, The Mercenary, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere now in hardcover or Kindle edition. However you like to read books, you can grab it. It's available now. We'll put links to it in the show notes of this episode to make it easy for people to find. Paul, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
I have a website, and it is paulvidich.com, and that's PaulVidich.com.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Paul, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I love The Mercenary. We're sending everyone to pick up a copy of it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Well, thank you.